based on the true story of Marty Chingling. The title of his talk today is America as a Global Vigilante, Foreign Policy, Public Opinion, and Hollywood Mythmaking. Let's welcome Professor Calavita.
All right, how are we doing? Good. So I'm going to be talking to you today about American foreign policy, but American foreign policy linked to something that we wouldn't traditionally think that has a connection to, and that is Hollywood movies, and what it is that Hollywood movies communicate to us, typically without us fully realizing it. We tend to think of Hollywood movies as something trivial and disposable, that it's just entertainment, right? That Hollywood movies are for our entertainment, for our amusement, and as far as deep messages that they might be communicating to us, or serious values or worldviews, that's not something that we tend to go to movies for. It's certainly not something that we expect movies to supply into our sort of cultural or social or political bloodstream, but I'm going to suggest that that's part of what forms the way we look at the world from the vantage point of the United States and its foreign policy. So the title of this, America as Global Vigilante, by vigilante, in a nutshell, as a simplification of that word, what I essentially mean is going beyond the law to get something done, and not minding what toes you step on, or maybe what people you kill, to get the job done, to get justice and to make sure that you prevail. That's something that happens a lot in Hollywood movies, and to some extent it can be likened to what American foreign policy is, that where might makes right, and we are always right, and there's not really much that we can do that could be classified as wrong because we are right. So if we think in terms of an ideal model, like if this were a political science class, if we were to think about an ideal model of American public opinion and political and governmental decision-making and foreign policy, and how those things would link together, ideally, in the United States, the richest and most powerful and ostensibly most advanced country in the history of the world, ideally, an ideal model of that might feature thoughtful discourse, an informed and engaged and rational citizenry, Americans who are smart and well-informed and rational and engaged with what's going on, long-term planning, where we don't think about just what's going to happen tomorrow or even next year. We think about, trying to create a better world, a safer world for us and for the whole world decades into the future. I mean, I'm a dad. I have a 9-year-old and a 9-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter, and I'm often thinking, what kind of world are they going to inherit? What's the world going to be like 30 years from now when they're, my age or approaching my age? What's the world going to be like? As a country, ideally, we'd be doing a lot of long-term planning. Ideally, there would be a lot of intercultural and international understanding between the United States and other countries. Ideally, we'd have humanistic values and principles that we live up to. Human life is sacrosanct and all people matter and so on. We would have the news media functioning as sober watchdogs of the political process, of our foreign policy, of the citizenry, and the kinds of opinions that we tend to have. And we would have enlightened and courageous political leadership. Well, I don't think I'm throwing out any spoilers, but that's not necessarily what we have. Ideally, that's what we have. What we have is, doesn't really measure up to that. And, to some extent that's understandable. It doesn't mean that we can't wish for better. It's not what we actually have. What we actually have, both in terms of from the perspective of citizens and also from the perspective, frankly, of the politicians and the bureaucrats and the administrators who craft our foreign policy, journalists also, who are supposed to be watching over all of this, we often lean on heuristics and schemas, which are essentially mental shortcuts to make sense of a really complicated and messy world where there are several billions of people. The United States is only roughly 4% of the population of the world. Like 95-something% of the world is not in the United States. Many billions of people are not Americans, and to make sense of what's going on around the world, we take a lot of mental shortcuts to make sense of what's going on and maybe what American foreign policy should be. So, for example, one common shortcut used is analogies, just to sort of boil down and simplify the whole messy world out there from the vantage point of the United States. So an analogy like when it comes to dealing with terrorism or foreign leaders who we are wary of or feel like we need to combat. One analogy might be, well, and actually technically this is a simile. I wouldn't want an English teacher to kick my ass for this. Technically this is a simile, not an analogy. The world is like a schoolyard, and foreign terrorists and dictators are the bullies. Simple as that. And you have to hit bullies hard enough that they never bully you again. That's so simple as to be so appealing, because it basically short circuits thought and makes it seem as if, yeah, I can get my head around that. The vast messiness of the actual world and actual foreign policy and what it actually means to combat terrorism today and decades into the future, it's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. Just one simple example, if you go to school and then you hit a bully hard enough that they never bully you again, that doesn't typically mean that you also accidentally killed 90 other kids in the schoolyard who had nothing to do with this interaction. You don't hit that bully and then 90 other kids on the schoolyard die. And then their families are upset at you and you've probably bred future terrorists. It's a little more complicated in the real world. And for our purposes, and what I'm mainly going to talk about, are thinking about foreign policy and, for example, how to deal with something like terrorism, which when it comes to our foreign policy these days, in light of the events of, let's say, the last 15 years, in light of the events, let's say that just took place in New York City where a bomb was set off and 29 people were injured. When we talk foreign policy, what we tend to be talking about these days is how do we deal with the ongoing threat of terrorism. And our thinking about something like that will often lean on our immersion in our readily available narratives, the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves over and over and over again and have for a long time, and the myths that often come hand in hand with that. And by myths, I don't mean like Greek myths or Roman myths, and I don't mean like myths that Mythbusters will try to, take on a reality show. Like, if you put Pop Rocks in Coke, will it set off an explosion? Like, not that kind of myth. Myths like things that are just kind of unquestioned, taken for granted ways of sort of understanding the world. A classic example is the myth of beauty, that beauty looks, a particular, beauty is one particular thing. The lessons that those kinds of narratives and myths hold are very powerful for us. They tend to be very powerful for us. I would argue in significant ways very powerful for us because we don't tend to assume that they are powerful for us. We don't tend to assume that the kinds of things that we encounter, for example, in movies or TV shows or the book or novels that we read, we don't tend to assume that those kinds of things are important, are powerful, and by assuming that they're not that powerful, they're able to sort of integrate themselves into what we think of as just common sense, rational thought. And, a lot of that is what we encounter in Hollywood movies. The narratives, the stories that we see over and over again in Hollywood movies. Now, when we talk about Hollywood movies, it is important not just to talk about the subject matter and the specific kinds of stories that they're telling, and I would suggest that oftentimes a big part of the story that they're telling in like action movies and war movies, a big part of the story that they're telling is one where we or the character that we are sympathizing with, identifying with, rooting for, are somehow attacked or wronged, and then the rest of the movie is really a pursuit of justice, a pursuit of making things right after we've been done wrong. So that's the story that's typically told, and it fits very neatly in the structure of most movies. We don't tend to think of this when we are watching a movie, but there is an underlying architecture to 90-something% of the Hollywood movies that we see. They tend to have 3 acts, a first act where things are set up, a second act where there's a confrontation, and a third act where there's a resolution. Late in the first act, there's what's called an inciting incident, where something really significant, something substantial happens that sets the rest of the story in motion. And the vast majority of the time, the problem or the conflict gets solved by the end. End of problem, end of conflict, we have resolution. And when it's action movies and war movies where someone is getting hurt or wronged, that's typically the inciting incident. And then the characters on screen and we as the audience, we are buckled in for the narrative ride of how are we going to get back at those bastards who, killed my dog, kidnapped my daughter, shot at the president, assaulted my wife, killed my best friend, whatever it might be. There's always some horrible wrong done to the main character, the hero who we're cheering on, and we are ready for that main character to basically do anything to the bad guys to get a happy ending. And you might ask yourself, well, what kinds of confrontations and resolutions tend to come about from that kind of narrative structure? How many action movies or war movies find a resolution with the hero confronting the bad guys and saying, you know what? I'm going to let you live. And frankly, I think we and the world at large should talk through our problems rather than resorting to violence. Violence is the lowest form of, dealing with what ails us. Why not? How many movies can you think of end with, talking things out, diplomacy, regular legal machinery making its way through, the justice process and someone actually going to prison? It's quite rare, actually. What happens is, 5 minutes before the end of the movie, the hero or heroes, they kill those motherfuckers who did them wrong, pardon my language. And we are cheering with bloodlust, even when the heroes, the main characters, clearly are breaking the law, clearly are going beyond the law. They have become vigilantes, and we have become their supporters. Narratives, generally speaking, are a really significant way in which our mode of thought gets shaped. The way we tend to think of the world and how messy and complicated it is, it ends up standing to reason that we rely on things like schemas and mental shortcuts to simplify things. Stories do the same thing. Stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, they lend some clarity to what is otherwise just too complicated, typically, for our minds to be able to handle, especially when we have a million other things that we are dealing with and that we are thinking about. And what I was saying before about how we tend not to attribute that much importance to narratives that aren't explicitly political is one of the ways in which they are able to sort of insinuate themselves into our thinking, our values, our worldview, because we don't think that we are being told anything that's particularly significant. We drop our intellectual guard. We're moved emotionally, and this seems to make us rubbery and easy to shape. Stories and images and characters, they want us to become invested. They want us to lose ourselves in the story. That doesn't, suggest a lot of intellectual engagement or a lot of critical thought, and that's for a reason, because you don't tend to sort of get involved in something in a dramatic story when you are sort of putting up a critical thinking guard against that story. You don't tend to, unless you're a nerd like me and you do this for a living, you don't tend to watch an action movie and say, okay, let's see what kind of political messages are going to insinuate themselves into the narrative of this action movie. No, you watch the action movie and you want to see some ass kicking. You want to be entertained. You want to be amused. You want to be moved. You want parts of you that maybe are semi-ugly to be satisfied in a way that's safe and socially acceptable. And those kinds of stories, those kinds of characters, that kind of imagery that you're going to be exposed to typically is going to rely pretty heavily on myths that go back a long ways in American culture. Myths about, kick-ass heroes going beyond the law to get things done goes back a long ways. I mean, just in terms of American culture, it certainly goes back to the classic kind of Western imagery and storytelling of the 19th century. So you're talking a good 150 years easily. And that kind of frontier mentality where, if necessary, you shoot first and ask questions later because, the sheriff of the town is probably an ineffectual wimp. And if you're going to get things done, get the bad guy or get the Native Americans who might be overrunning the town, you got to use force. You got to use violence. That's what not just a real man does, but that's what a smart man does. Because that's the fastest route to justice. That's the fastest route to problem solving. I also mentioned briefly how when we are watching movies, part of that transaction, part of what we're expecting from a movie is some satisfaction, or what in media research is sometimes called uses and gratifications. It's an interesting exercise, I think, to ask yourself, when you are watching a movie, or let's say a TV show, it's interesting to ask yourself, apart from just the obvious, oh, I want to be entertained, or oh, I want to veg out and not really have to think for a while. That kind of superficial, like, default response doesn't explain much. If you want to get at something a little bit more interesting, ask yourself, what uses are you making of a movie? What gratification are you getting from a movie? We all have the option, especially if you just, roam around Netflix, we all have the option anytime of watching one of thousands of movies. When we choose one, why are we choosing it? What are we expecting from it? Well, a lot of media research would suggest that part of what we're expecting from it is to be satisfied on levels that we're not necessarily conscious of. We want aspects of ourselves to be satisfied by this kind of weird, vicarious, dreamlike storytelling. And we typically subject that to very little thought, very little scrutiny, but it's kind of worth thinking about. So when it comes to action movies and war movies, especially ones that have a pretty simplistic structure of we've been attacked, or we've been wronged, or we've been aggrieved, now let's go out there and kick some ass and tell the diplomats and the cops and all the wimps to step aside while we get the job done in entertaining fashion with violence. That tends to satisfy the people who are watching that on an unconscious level. What is it satisfying? Well, you don't have to be a Freudian psychologist or sort of follower of psychoanalytic thought to maybe understand that we tend to have some anger inside of us that we don't really know what to do with, but we know it's not socially acceptable to, get out of our car. I was cut off in traffic today. And I can't say that I consciously thought this in the moment, but now thinking back on it, my impulses were to get out of the car, go over to that person's car, open the car door, and start pummeling him in his face until he started bleeding and bruising and, I don't know, was until he was seriously injured. I was angry. But we live in a society of laws and norms. What am I supposed to do with that anger? I probably retained some of that anger all day. What am I supposed to do with that anger? Now, some of you might be thinking, dude, yeah, I guess you're just like kind of an angry dude. Like, I guess that's your thing. If you assume that you're not keeping some anger deep down that needs to be let out in socially acceptable ways, you're living in denial. We have frustrations, we have angers, we have anger, we have resentments, and movies, especially movies where one person dominates other people, has been found in media research to be very satisfying to people who carry with them, anger that has not been dealt with well. Now, is that a healthy arrangement? No, not necessarily. Especially if we are unaware of the fact that movies are connecting with us on that level and sort of reaching us on a level of anger and resentment. the stories that they might be telling us and that are reaching, sort of our anger and resentment, they might be kind of significant. So up until this point, you might be asking yourself, what movies exactly are you talking about? Because when I think of Hollywood, sure, there are action movies, sure, there are war movies, but isn't Hollywood liberal? Isn't Hollywood just full of a bunch of like touchy-feely wimps who inevitably vote for Bernie Sanders and, think that peace and diplomacy and all of that are the only way to live our lives, and they're probably all Buddhists and feminists and gay and a bunch of like liberal weirdos. That's what Hollywood is, right? That's certainly the impression that a certain segment of political punditry and political discourse, that's a certain way that it classifies Hollywood. What I would suggest to you is that when Hollywood makes movies that are explicitly political, that make it clear that they are communicating political messages, 8 or 9 times out of 10, those movies are indeed liberal. And oftentimes they get nominated for Academy Awards. They tend to be movies about like pioneers and fights for equal rights and stuff like that, although interestingly they tend to be set like 40 or 50 years in the past. It's interesting to look at quote-unquote liberal Hollywood movies and how few of them are actually set in the present day. Liberal Hollywood movies, they tend to be set in like, the 50s or the 60s or 70s, safely in the past. So when movies are explicitly political, they tend to be pretty liberal in their messages, I would suggest. When movies are not explicitly political, and that's most movies, most Hollywood movies are not explicitly political, but most movies, their sort of underlying structure and the way they sort of end with resolution and involve an individual overcoming obstacles to solve problems, oftentimes with violence, those movies that are implicitly political, those tend to not be touchy-feely in their values and their messages. Hollywood, I would say, is predominantly populated by Democrats, but they're Democrats who make a certain kind of movie repeatedly with their eye on reaching as broad an audience as possible, not just in this country, but around the world. So let's talk about where roughly this vigilante violence as justice kind of theme and subgenre of movies began. I would argue that it began in the early 1970s with movies like Dirty Harry, Death Wish, The French Connection, and many others, and they've continued sort of unabated since then. There are particular reasons why there's been a rise of not just action movies, but action movies where almost inevitably, the main characters go beyond the law in a way that is just made to seem logical and like common sense by them and then by the audience rooting them on too. One reason is the fact that movies have become more violent since the late 1960s because the rating system changed. One reason is because foreign markets for Hollywood movies are more important than ever, and a movie about a bunch of people like talking about their feelings and coming to diplomatic solutions to problems that ail us, that would require a lot of dubbing and wouldn't necessarily be so easily understood in Lithuania, Brazil, Japan, etc. Whereas, shooting a gun requires no dubbing and is pretty universally understood. There's the decline in the production of what are called mid-budget Hollywood dramas. Think of how many regular Hollywood dramas get made these days and end up in, at the local multiplex. Hollywood dramas that involve people talking have declined significantly in the 21st century, in roughly the last 15 years or so. That's partly because there's so much good TV drama for people to watch, and it's partly, again, because of foreign markets. Foreign markets don't like drama. They tend not to like certain kinds of comedy either. You've got the corporate takeovers of Hollywood studios and the increasingly bottom line thinking of whatever the product is, let's just put it out there in the hopes of getting as big an audience as possible. That is slightly different from what the Hollywood studios used to do. And then you have the rise of Hollywood blockbusters beginning in the late 1970s with movies like Star Wars, Superman, Raiders of the Lost Ark. The rise of those blockbusters and the rise of, video game adaptations and comic book superhero movies and all their sequels and reboots, those kinds of stories have certain kinds of themes to them and have certain kinds of structures to the way they are going to tell us about the world. There's going to be a problem that involves violence done to the people we are identifying with, the heroes and heroines. And then by the end of the movie, right will be done by violence being perpetrated against the people who are violent towards us. That has been increasingly the sort of story structure and storytelling of the biggest budget Hollywood movies, with the exception maybe of animated movies geared towards kids. But apart from that, the biggest budget movies, they tend to involve big spectacle and big violence. So that's what's been going on in Hollywood for the last 45 years or so. In society, as a partial explanation for why people respond to these kinds of movies where the heroes kick ass and go beyond the law to do in the bad guys, you've got the rise of white male grievances and the perceived loss of power during this time, especially since the 60s and 70s, in the face of women's rights, gay rights, civil rights, economic insecurity, crime, youth culture, and so on. Straight white men, when I was talking about that anger, straight white men, studies have been showing for a while now, tend to carry with them maybe an added bit of anger in response to social change, especially since the 70s. You have the end of the Vietnam War and the unhealed wounds that came from the end of the Vietnam War, and the kinds of lessons and memories that we learned incorrectly, but that we learned after Vietnam, including, on the part of a lot of people, this idea that the reason why Vietnam didn't go better was because we didn't use enough power. We didn't go far enough in our prosecution of that war. I would suggest, and that what happened was, the media, hippie protesters, and I don't know who else, bureaucrats, got in the way of us being able to, win Vietnam with enough power, enough righteous power. Now, I would suggest to you that that is insanity when you consider how many people were killed in Vietnam, how many bombs were dropped, how many people were injured. It's a frightening toll. The idea that we didn't fight that war hard enough is like sort of upside down bizarro world. And yet we seem to have learned the lesson, like, yeah, Vietnam, that war that the United States didn't win, and it was like a real black mark on American history. The reason why we didn't win is because we didn't go hard enough. We didn't go far enough. We didn't push the envelope. That envelope got pushed. That envelope got seriously pushed. Like millions of people dying, ton of money being spent, a lot of the world being sort of thrown for a loop. That was not a war that was not fought hard enough. We have America's global power and standing and efficacy perceived to be in decline. We have the accelerated demonization and trivialization of government, of public institutions, of diplomats, of infrastructure, basically of the things that people are able to do collectively according to rules and laws. Those things have fallen in people's sort of respect and estimation, especially since the 70s, and that has an impact. We end up assuming that if those things have fallen in terms of their efficacy, in terms of their ability to solve problems, as opposed to maybe making problems, that maybe what we need is just, individuals with some firepower to solve problems. TV news and the way that it, communicates to us in a very decontextualized way, the way it simplifies what's going on in the world, that is now the sort of prime vehicle of our public discourse. And that kind of simplicity, frankly, there isn't any really much better way to put it. It dumbs us down. It dumbs us down. TV news is visual, immediate, simplistic, and tends to be ahistorical. It tends to sort of blank out the history behind what is happening now, and that's a real problem. And of course, you have the actual, real, significant and troubling rise of modern terrorism. Terrorism is a real, scary threat, of course. And in the last 15 years or so, or if you want to go back all the way to like the late 60s or early 70s, it's been a threat. And 15 years ago on September 11th, it was deadly and awful and tragic. And we as a country continue to live with the threat of terrorism, and it's serious. This is not the stuff of, there's no threat and we should just, ignore it. No, we're living in the real world, and terrorism is a significant, profound issue, and that scares people. It scares people. People are fearful. You mix that fear in with the anger that we maybe carry around with us, and those kinds of movie narratives can be quite powerful for us and quite appealing. This is a small sampling of some recent Hollywood vigilante violence as justice movies. These are movies where the good guys go beyond the law or just ignore the law and use violence to solve problems. And we as the audience, in the vast majority of these situations, we the audience root them on, not minding that they're doing awful things. When I say awful things, clearly within the confines of the narrative, they are doing things that seem warranted virtually always, right? It's not like if the bad guy kills your son, the main character and we as the audience are not going to be sort of in subconscious dialogue saying, forgive the guy. Forgive the guy who killed your son. Come to some understanding. Get spiritual. Get spiritual. Preach nonviolence. Forgive that person. Read the Bible with that person in prison every day for the rest of your life. That'll be a satisfying movie narrative. No. When someone gets aggrieved, when they get wronged, we're rooting for some visual, exciting, entertaining payback. And that usually involves violence. This is just a small sample, by the way, from the last, 7 or 8 years. And it might just seem kind of normal and logical within movies when we watch them for people to be breaking the law to get something done, because usually to not do that would seem like the wrong choice within the logic of the movie. But here's a news flash: movies are made up. So the confines of their narratives are always contrived in a particular way to make us think that everything that the hero is doing is right and logical. But the contrived storylines of movies, they don't tend to actually happen in everyday life. They are heightened versions of what goes on in everyday life. And that list doesn't even include most superhero movies, where people who sort of at the core of their being, what they do is they use power and violence to solve problems on the behalf of, weak people, meaning the rest of us. And they tend to have names that tell us a lot about their likely, meanings and messages. Iron Man. You think going to see a movie called Iron Man is going to result with people like sitting around a table and crying and saying like, it just feels so good to hear you say, talk about your feelings and then I can talk about my feelings. Or like the signing of a peace accord. Is a movie called The Avengers. It's in the title. They're avenging things. They're avenging things. It's working with the assumption that we need things avenged. Not for things to happen according to the law, not for things to happen according to international treaties. No, people in tights killing villains for our $11. It's there in the title. The Avengers. Captain America. Is Captain America a diplomat? No. Is the Dark Knight a diplomat? No. Is Batman a diplomat? No, Batman is like a classic example of, Batman is a lunatic. Batman is a lunatic. He's a rich guy still mourning the tragic death of his parents. He dresses up in some weird-ass, kinky, black bat suit and goes out at night to kill criminals. He's a lunatic. Ideally, Bruce Wayne would be in therapy. Now, by the way, I love all these movies. This is not to say that these movies are bad or wrong or not well done. I love The Dark Knight. I love that movie. But Batman is a lunatic. It's only within the logic and the confines of those narratives that we would never see the movie and come out and say to our buddy, like, yeah, that was pretty good, but Batman's a lunatic. I don't know why I was rooting him on. The movie is not asking you to respond that way. The movie is asking you to cheer him on no matter what he does. Man of Steel? Yeah, he probably does a lot of talking, right? Now, that it's implied by all of these names that force and power and domination in the pursuit of problem solving is what this is all going to be about. And this list doesn't even include, yay, Taken, which was a monster hit at the box office when it came out in 2009. And it spawned 2 sequels. And Taken is a classic example of this kind of movie. If you take Brian Mills, the Liam Neeson character, as a kind of stand-in for American foreign policy, yes, the people who kidnapped his daughter, they're the scum of the earth, and we want everything that happens to them according to the logic of the movie. And yes, you could make the argument that it's good that Taken sort of brought to the table in a more visible way the horrible issue of, forced sex slavery and the sex trade. All that's true, but this guy, if you sort of retrace what this guy does, he tortures and kills his way to finding his daughter, and is doing really frightening, horrible things, all of which we are understood to make sense given the particular contrivances of the story. But let's review. You just watched him torture someone, and I know we all wanted him to torture that guy. We all wanted him to kill that guy, but just for a little bit of, sanity for a second, he is de facto committing murder there. He is breaking French law. He is breaking international law. He's breaking, United States law by torturing that guy and then by killing that guy. Like, I don't know. I believe you, but it won't save you. Ah! And deep down, most of us watching do this. Yeah! Take that, scumbag! Like he got all the information that he was going to get out of this guy. But you can't just let him live. No, torture him to death. Sweet. Within the logic of the movie, and this is inevitably the case, within the logic of the movie, we don't look at him and say, ooh, this guy's got a screw loose. No, we say within the contrivances of the plot, that makes sense. That makes sense. Later on, he shoots the wife of the French police official to get information that he wants, even though she has nothing to do with any of this. Want to make a cake, you're going to break a few eggs, Want to make it a nice omelet, you're going to drop a few eggs on the floor. He shoots this woman. Ah! Sorry, bad luck for you. I've got some goals. I've got some problems that need solving. And the scene that you saw that led up to the torturing and the murder, I mean, that's what he did to that guy was murder. Not saying that we weren't all rooting for that, but he murdered that guy. He's in that room with all the Albanian scumbags, and he's a badass straight white guy American. And he's got a special set of skills, and, he dominates. He shows his superiority over all those guys, all those losers. Is that realistic? Not in the slightest. Think about how hardened and scary the pasts of all those, 8, 9 guys in that room are? Those are not guys who I become criminal now. I used to be postman. So I have no skills. No, these are guys who are probably ex-military, have probably been involved with crime, shooting guns, getting in fights since they were teenagers. So he's surrounded by 8 or 9 guys like that. No matter. No matter. He's a straight, white, badass American come to collect a bill, and he's going to dominate them. He's going to show American superiority, and might makes right. Might makes right. So what I am not arguing here in saying that American movies can insinuate themselves into our value systems, into our worldviews, maybe even into sort of collectively public opinion about how we should be carrying out foreign policy, whether or not we should torture, whether or not, drone strikes over and over and over again that regularly kill civilians, whether that kind of thing is appropriate. the way that movies are insinuating themselves into the way we look at these issues, the way we understand and misunderstand them. What I'm not arguing is that it's easy to craft effective foreign policy. I don't imagine that it's easy for President Obama, people in the State Department, people in Congress, people at American consulates around the world. I don't imagine that crafting effective foreign policy is easy. It's not that easy for Americans to be informed and rational when there's a lot going on and we're dealing with information overload. I'm not arguing that American military force is never warranted, because personally, I think sometimes it is. But unfortunately, we are sort of wrapped up in this recurring narrative of, we get attacked, let's go kick some ass. We get attacked, let's go kick some ass. We get attacked, let's go kick some ass. And every time we kick ass, we're probably breeding new terrorists. I'm not arguing that Hollywood studios and filmmakers are willfully and intentionally making propaganda. I don't think the people making movies are trying to do this. I think they are essentially making fast food. They know what it is easy to put into movies to get a decent audience, and that tends to include men with guns solving problems. Chingling said earlier that I do some screenwriting, and it's true. I've written a number of screenplays, and I've gotten to the point where some people in Hollywood pay attention to what I write, but not to the point where they have bought something yet. I recently talked to someone who's worked in Hollywood for a long time and who's read my work, and she said, you know, Marco, what it gets down to is you're trying to thread a needle with the kind of stuff that you write, and it's very hard to do when most of what Hollywood wants to make, what tends to be most marketable, especially these days, when most of the money that movies make is in overseas markets. What Hollywood tends to want to buy is white guy with a gun movies. White guy with a gun movies. When you try to imagine, like, sort of the story and the messages that would encompass, that would sort of fill in a whole movie around that idea, white guy with a gun, that's a particular kind of movie. That's a particular kind of movie. Hollywood is not making those movies because they want us to, I don't know, be in favor of vigilante-like American foreign policy where we torture and, you know, send out drones that kill civilians. And Hollywood has no desire to do that. They're just doing their thing, and it results in that indirectly, I would argue. I'm also not arguing that all Hollywood movies are bad. I love movies. I'm not arguing that we're all affected by Hollywood movies in the same way. That's a very complicated process, and a lot of it has to do with what we bring to the experience and what kind of faculties and sort of baggage we have, and maybe what kinds of satisfactions we're trying to get from movies. And I'm also not arguing that Hollywood movies are the only kind of media that are relevant to this discussion. I would argue that the news plays into this. I would argue that TV shows play into this. 24 is like the television brother of the Taken movies. And video games, I would argue, play into this. How many video games are first-person shooter games where, in essence, you are trying to solve problems as part of the story by killing people? A lot of the more popular games are ones where you are in the position of needing to dominate other forces, other people with violence in order to solve problems, get to the next level, push the story, etc. just as a thought experiment, ask yourself, how often on the news do you see people preaching peace and diplomacy and long-term thinking? Like, hey guys, when we drop bombs, maybe we are killing some of our enemies, and that can be positive, if those enemies are bent on our destruction. But is it possible in thinking long-term, are we also breeding more and more people that hate us? Are we possibly breeding more and more terrorists? I mean, in July, some airstrikes killed something like 80 Syrian civilians. Now, I don't think the United States did that intentionally, but the fact is that in our name, those of us who are United States citizens, 80 civilians were killed. I get a little frightened if I sort of fall into some thinking about, the family members and friends of those 80 civilians and what kind of resentment and grudges and anger they're going to be harboring towards the United States. What do you think the chances are that those 80 civilians killed, that a few new terrorists are going to sprout up because of that? I don't know, but it doesn't seem far-fetched. You don't see a lot of talk of peace, diplomacy, long-term thinking based on understanding on the news. TV shows. How many TV shows can you think of that are about diplomats? Or about peace, activists, or anything related to solving problems specifically without violence? Grey's Anatomy? Isn't that a show about doctors in a hospital? I'm not saying that there aren't shows that aren't about violence, but where actively they are avoiding violence in the pursuit of other means of solving problems. And video games. The West Wing, sort of, but after I've watched every episode of The West Wing. After 9/11, by like 2002, 2003, even the sort of, ultra-progressive, thoughtful, spiritual president wanted an ounce of flesh. He was intent on kicking ass himself. That show changed course at a certain point. And video games, I mean, how many millions and millions and millions of video games sell that revolve around, killing your enemy? And how many video games are there, again, about other ways of solving problems? And where are the movies about the heroic virtues and problem-solving efficacy of public institutions, constitutional rights and human rights, intellectual curiosity about the world, the United Nations or UNICEF or the Peace Corps, reducing our dependence on foreign oil? Are you falling asleep yet? Diplomacy, nonviolence, these do not seem at first glance to be good movie subject matter, but that's really just based on the way our tastes have been shaped, what our expectations are, and what Hollywood feels safe in making. It's very rare that a movie is actively endorsing these kinds of things. An exception that proves the rule would be something like Bridge of Spies, that movie that came out a couple months ago. That kind of falls into this category, but you'd be hard-pressed to come up with 4 or 5 more, whereas I could add to that list of 60, or however many it was, vigilante violence as justice movies. I could add to that list really easily. And with your help, we could probably come up with a list of 100 video games where it's like, I gotta kill this many guys to get to the next level. That's a certain way of framing, sort of the world around us. And it doesn't have to be this way. This is what seems normal and logical because this is the way our expectations have been shaped based on our experiences. But all of these are contrivances. All of these are constructions. All of these are what has happened before. It doesn't have to be what continues to happen. Thank you very much. Yes.
So you talk about how movies kind of shape our perspective on what extent and to what lengths we should go to get justice or to, resolve conflict. What are your thoughts on stuff like the death penalty or life in prison? Do you think that mentality kind of shapes, the way that we view media? Like, man, that guy's awful. He gets the death penalty now. We should just end it here. Do you think that? I guess what are your
Sure. I mean, the extent to which the criminal justice system really focuses on the punitive, the harshly punitive, I think it stems in part from these sorts of things. I mean, between the mid-'60s and the early '90s, crime was, pretty high. Since the early '90s, crime has fallen pretty steadily. So people do have valid reasons for being angry about crime and wanting to accent punishment. That's not coming from nowhere. Crime is real. But if the focus is on reducing crime as opposed to just getting revenge or just the good feeling that comes from punishing bad guys, the same kind of dialogue could be had as the one I'm talking about here, where if you want less crime, think about where crime comes from. And unless you have an incredibly simplistic view of the world, crime doesn't come from, well, certain people are evil and certain people are good. And we should protect the good, and when the evil do their evil deeds, we punish them. Things are a lot more complicated than that. And yet we don't tend to really invest in, again, long-term crime fighting apart from building prisons and investing, the police with an enormous amount of power. And the death penalty, support for the death penalty has fallen somewhat in the last 25 years or so at the same time that violent crime has fallen. And those things are probably not completely unrelated. But people are also just sort of becoming more aware of the fact that there are a lot of people who are, on death row who have been wrongfully convicted. Logic and good evidence suggests that, in our names, people have been executed who are innocent. That's become more known, and that has some effect, I think. Yeah.
What would you advise on how people can move away from this vigilante narrative?
I think we can support different kinds of movies. I think we can be more aware of the actual complexities of what's going on in the world, and that movies do insinuate themselves into our thinking, into our values. You all, I'm sure, are a bunch of really sharp tacks. Like, I bet you all, maybe with some exceptions, are smart people. But I would suggest to you that you probably overestimate what kind of critical thinkers you are and what kind of awareness you bring to, let's say, movie narratives and the kinds of things that movies are communicating to you. You might be thinking, while I'm talking, yeah, I wouldn't fall for that. I'm not going to see an action movie and then let that shape my view of the world. It's just an action movie. I'm smarter than that. I would suggest that it doesn't mean that you're not smart. I would just suggest that your mind is not working on that level when you are watching movies. I do this for a living, and I think my views and my values get shaped by movies profoundly. And I do this for a living. I bug the hell out of my wife constantly talking back to movies and TV shows. And yet, I still think I'm being shaped. Now imagine you don't do this for a living. You haven't been thinking about this kind of stuff for like 25, 30 years. Do you think it's possible that you're being affected just in a way that you're not necessarily aware of? So partly I would just suggest being kind of modest and humble about the possibility that the things that movies communicate to you, they might be reaching you. They might be reaching you. It doesn't mean that you can't be like a fan of action movies and also like a peace activist, because there are people who are like that. It's not like anything that you encounter in movies immediately affects you like a shot to your arm. It's more complicated than that. But subtly and over time, on a recurring basis, if these are the stories and these are the images, we might tend to lean on them as explanations for the way things work and the way that things should be. So awareness, media literacy, and just sort of understanding the complexity of things. And that, similes and analogies, they tend not to be that useful if you're truly trying to understand something. You may have noticed it just in the news yesterday. The son of one of the major party candidates for president of the United States. This is like serious business here. He actually tweeted out an image of a bowl of Skittles. And he said, the refugee crisis and the issue of terrorism can be summarized like this. If you have a bowl of Skittles, and you know that 3 of those Skittles are poisonous and could kill you, would you eat a handful of Skittles? The idea being like if we let in Syrian refugees, well, inevitably, there are going to be a bunch who are terrorists and who are going to kill us, so we probably shouldn't let in any. We would be here until midnight for me to explain all the ways in which that is idiotic. But let me just start with, well, first of all, that's something that originated on a white supremacist website. So that's probably not something that you want to be, tweeting out, stuff that comes from a white supremacist site. But second of all, it does not fit actual statistical evidence. If you have a bowl of like 100 Skittles, you wouldn't say that 3 of them are poisonous. If you want to analogize the bowl of Skittles to Syrian refugees, the actual evidence suggests that you would have to let in something like 1.6 billion Syrian refugees to, on average, have one of them be a deadly terrorist. So 3 out of 100, not really the same as 1 out of 1.6 billion. And finally, if you're thinking about grabbing some Skittles, whether or not you grab some Skittles doesn't affect whether other Skittles are going to decide to become poisonous and make their way into your diet. But if we are refusing Syrian refugees, do you think that's going to cultivate future terrorists? Yes, inevitably. All the research and logic would suggest that if we're refusing refugees, and like that's what America stands for, that's the kind of thing that makes other people in the world hate us. Whereas if we were welcoming and said, yes, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. And sure, Syrian refugees who have spent like 18 months being vetted and checked out over and over and over again, and any of them who seem even vaguely threatening don't get let in. Sure, let's maybe let in some of those Syrian refugees and show the world America is good and righteous and accepting and humanistic, and saying, no, I'm not going to eat any Skittles doesn't make other Skittles decide to become poisonous. The world's more complicated than a bowl of Skittles. Anyway. Thank you very much.